But shall we get into the actual movie at hand?
Yeah, I feel this is another monumental task. So this one has a bit more ambiguity between the two of us as to our opinions.
Yes.
So do you want to introduce it?
Yes. So this movie of the week on the BFI list is Sam Peckinpah's 1969 classic, The Wild Bunch, starring William Holden.
Ernest
I don't remember the
Borgnine.
rest. Ernest Borgnine. I don't know. It's a 1969 Western. Very violent. Very atypical in a lot of ways. But I think we should just start with the parallels here to the Sierra Madre, because there are plenty.
Yeah, I guess even before we get into that, I'd be curious. This is to hear your viewing history with this film. And
okay,
if you want basic opinion, or we can just go into
well, I'll just go parallels. I'll just go with my opinions of it before the second viewing.
Okay.
Back when me and Jacob lived in relatively the same city, and I would see him, and every time I would see him, he'd thrust a new Blu-ray on me, claiming it as essential cinema. One of them was The Wild Bunch, and he didn't give me the Blu-ray, but he told me to watch it. I saw it at Zia, pretty cheap, so I thought, okay, I'll watch this. I know a lot of people enjoy it. I watched it about a year and a half ago, October 2018, and I thought that was pretty good. I didn't think it was amazing. I thought it was a pretty solid Western, comparatively. There's a lot I liked, a lot I didn't like, but overall a solid 4 out of 5, pretty good movie.
And I can't remember the first time I watched it. I think it's been quite some time, and it might have been the very first year of college that I watched it for the first time. Although it might have been before that. The first time I watched it, I said to myself, "Well, that was good." But I think much the same reaction that you had. Not anything great, not bad, just good. And then the second time I watched it, which was maybe 2 years ago now, junior year, I declared it as one of the best movies I've seen. It got onto my best favorite films of all time list at one point. But that was back when it was 66 movies long, and I think it was in the bottom half of that list. The edge. And the last review I wrote on Letterboxd of this film was, it has one of the best first acts of all time.
First acts, yep.
And I remember,
distinctly remember that.
You didn't fully agree with that. Anyway, my most recent viewing, I have a new opinion too, but we'll get into that. So
okay,
each one of them has been a different reaction at the end of the film. So, but yes, a lot of similarities between this film and Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And this film, like Treasure of the Sierra Madre, is very influential. So
it is. It very much is.
Lots to talk about.
Well, one of the bigger parts of this, the bigger parallels that I saw, was that most of this movie takes place outside of the U.S., whereas Sierra Madre is all outside of the U.S., but a majority of this movie takes place in Mexico.
Well, it was filmed, I think almost all of it was in Mexico. They might have done some studio reshoots once or twice, but everything, even the part that is supposed to be America, was filmed in Mexico. So it's interesting.
Now, what I appreciate about both of these movies is that in other movies that I've seen that has Mexico in it, or Mexico's a big part of it, they portray Mexicans in a very specific way. They're either the quote-unquote banditos, the rough, antagonistic Mexicans, and then the women are like these sex symbols, these ethnic Latina sex symbols. Both of these movies, more so The Wild Bunch than Sierra Madre, I think treats Mexicans in a way that is comparatively a lot more concerned with depicting the culture correctly. Not in the sense that their attitudes, specifically the general of that you see later in the film, but these women, these men, they all look like regular people. They're not crazy, beautified version of Mexican people. Like specifically in the scene where those two guys in the Wild Bunch are having fun with the prostitutes. Those women are allowed to be beautiful in the way that they are and not in a Hollywood manufactured sort of way.
Perhaps almost
And
a more modern idea of just kind of broadening that idea of beauty. They're not specific types.
Yes.
It's not, classic slim, fair, not lit
exactly
in that specific way that Hollywood typically does and all that. Not shown
and
to be angels or anything like that.
Yeah. And I appreciate about both these movies. I mean, obviously the more antagonistic Mexican people maybe draw on a few stereotypes, but it's one of those things where everyone was shitty in the Wild West. So I'm not going to call them racist for depicting shitty Mexicans, because
I think it would be hard to call either of these movies depictions of Mexicans as completely unfair. They do draw on some stereotypes. Yes. But I think what helps specifically is that there's a wide variety of Mexicans in both Treasure of the Sierra Madre and The Wild Bunch, in that you see just kind of the normal everyday villagers going about their business. They are very normal people. There's not much hoopla around them. But there's also these gang leaders in both of the films that, they do exist in Mexico.
Yeah.
Whether or not, there are some built up kind of stereotypes, but they're more respectful than a lot of the movies that are coming out during both of the time, during 1969 when this was made, and then is even worse portrayals back when Treasure of the Sierra Madre was made. But
I will say this. Okay, so just getting right to it, the second time, I like it a lot better. There's a lot that I didn't like that I like a lot better. And I will say this, Pike Bishop is one of my favorite Western characters ever. I love...
Such a great character.
He's an amazing character.
And it's
one of those things that... Honestly. Yeah. My favorite Western stories, I've always had two that have jumped out at me. And I'm saying stories because it's not necessarily limited to film. Although one of them, Unforgiven, I love Unforgiven. I think it's one of the best screenplays ever written. And the other one, which was hugely influenced by this, is the video game Red Dead Redemption 2, which has arguably the greatest Western story I've ever witnessed and one of the best stories ever. But so much of the Wild Bunch is in both of these movies. And I find it interesting because the prototypical Western, the John Wayne Western, or even this Sergio Leone Western, has a very specific idea of the Western hero. Well, they're not necessarily similar, but they're nothing like Pike Bishop.
I would say that my favorite Westerns in general are those that blur the line between the fantasy of Westerns and the reality, the gritty, terrible reality. And somewhere in between those two, it's hard to balance, really, because you have films like The Searchers, which is very much it has some reality to it. It has some kind of grit to it, but that's more to do with a character rather than the actual setting. And there's a lot of stereotypes based around that film. And
there's a lot.
In something like The Wild Bunch, it is a film that is both grounded in reality, in history, with Pancho Villa, who is this kind of background figure that really ties the film down to the real world and a real time and place in history. And it's one of the very few films that actually acknowledges Mexican history and the amount of civil strife that happens there, which is just great, having that grounding to this narrative. But there is also some glorification of this in a very interesting way that plays on a lot of the tropes of the genre. But there is, it's not all gritty realism. There is some kind of adventure.
The historical aspects are what really draw me to it, because it's very clear from the beginning on that this is the end. It's the end of the West. It's the end of Pike Bishop as, rugged frontier outlaw. And I was listening to a podcast about this movie that made a very interesting comparison. This movie is so in between the Old West and the modern era that where this movie takes place, the time frame of which the events of the Wild Bunch take place is the same time as both Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush and Lawrence of Arabia.
Hmm.
That's around the same time.
Yeah.
And they both feel like completely different worlds, but it's such an interesting time in American history where the Wild West is on its final leg. It says it lays this out early in the movie when you see the cars.
Mm-hmm.
We see the automobiles, we see the glimpse of the cars, and then one of the I think Ernest Borgnine talks about they got things like this back east that can fly, and it's very clear from the beginning that this is a movie about the end, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
There's a lot of what separates it from a lot of other westerns is there's a lot of references and sometimes very visual depictions of very not Western things. Cars,
yes,
machine guns, and airplanes. These law and order. And
yeah,
they talk about airplanes. As you mentioned.
Yeah, you're right.
And the temperance movement in the very beginning, this kind of social rallying,
which is hilarious, by the way.
It's not a Western thing. In Westerns, you don't have the people of the town rallying around social causes. There's no women's right movements in Westerns. Yeah. There's no temperance movements. There's no politics.
Temperance is the most anti-Western thing ever. Yes. Because every Western movie features characters that heavily drink.
And drinking is one of the really interesting little motifs throughout the film. And at least mostly visual. It becomes visual near the end. But you're right. This kind of very specific time period, and it's a film. Obviously, this isn't a new idea. It's a film about the end of the Western era, and it's a film that is playing on Western convention and turning it on its head in a lot of ways. And I think that's a lot of the reason why a lot of people find it almost maybe disconcerting when they watch it. I know one of my friends, I recently asked him, have you ever seen The Wild Bunch? Because I know he's a Western fan. He's like, that's a weird movie. I'm not sure I liked it. And I can see that reaction to this film because it is very similar and very different in a lot of ways to Westerns in general. And it's interesting. It's from 1969. And Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was also released this year, which is in kind of a similar vein. It's kind of the
revisionist
Western. I wouldn't say it's a revisionist. It's modern.
This one I would say is revisionist.
This is.
Yes.
Butch Cassidy is kind
of... Butch Cassidy is... Yeah.
It's a weird movie, but to classify.
Butch Cassidy is revisionist in the sense that it infuses a classic genre with relatively modern... Whereas Wild Bunch is revisionist in its structure, its plot, everything about it is...
Everything.
Yes.
The other film that was released this year was the original True Grit, which is very much a classic Western film. So I find that very interesting. There you have this kind of very broad spectrum of Westerns released in the same year. That the old idea of what a Western is still very much alive when this film was released in 1969.
It's not only that the actual plot is revisionist, the style is like a completely almost French New Wave-esque way of executing the Western.
Well, mainly in the editing.
Yeah, the editing specifically. The editing is one of those things that from first watch to second watch I became a lot more fond of. In the first watch, you can even check my Letterboxd review. I found the editing disorienting on the first watch, whereas the second watch I'm like, okay, I understand why this is happening. Famously, the two big shootouts, the intro shootout and the ending shootout in Mexico, the way that it was originally shot, like the way that Peckinpah like wanted it would have like expanded the movie by like 20 minutes. So the editor's like, well, let's try this.
I can see that.
Yes, there's
a lot of overlapping of sound, of visuals.
Yes.
There is double exposure in multiple times. This is a film where, we often think of the jump cut as the introduction of a new element to cinema. But the way that this film uses fades like nothing, no other film, which fades are like the original transition from way back when.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And yet this film uses them so ubiquitously for scene transitions that it's almost hipsterish of where it's using this classic technique, but it doesn't feel classic in any way.
Yeah.
Which is just shows you how much because I think that they are classic in the way that it's being used, the transitioning between scenes. Like if you're just taking it on its face value, that's just a very classic way of editing. But the rest of the film feels so new in the way that it's edited, feels so vibrant that you can't help but look at those in a different way. Like it feels different because of everything surrounding it.
Well, I was going to say another part of it, another thing that I find interesting is that this movie has a very like exploitation grindhouse aesthetic. I know Sergio Leone in the years previous, this came out 3 years after The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He sort of popularized the idea of making the Westerns dirty, more realistic, whereas the John Wayne type Westerns are very clean, very idealistic. I think that's another reason I love this movie. Everyone is disgusting in this movie.
So much
except for Pike. The weird prospector guy is just disgusting. The teeth in this movie are gross.
One of my favorite little moments in the film is Thornton, who is the member of Pike's gang who was betrayed by Pike and is now working for the railroad company to get them to repay his debt, kind of, instead of being in jail. And there's this great moment. It's after they blow up the bridge, and all of the bounty hunters are camping out by the river, and Thornton just wanders out of the brush, just covered in dirt. And he looks so tired and grimy, but also very stoic in a Western sort of way, which is one of the reasons, like, it's like it's there. Like this is not any kind of Hollywood depiction of actors. They had to get him dirty for this role. And it's something, you feel it in a way that this is one of the reasons why I love revisionist Westerns so much, and Westerns of this caliber, is that I agree. The thing that other older Westerns do is they do a disservice to the actual West, in that there's you're glorifying it, but you don't need to glorify the West, because there's plenty of glory there, but the dirt and the grime is so much more interesting too.
It's more like reflective of the Western aesthetic than the clean version, which is another reason I don't really like High Noon. Not to turn this into a High Noon discussion, but that it's just it's so gross. It's so gross. And as far as being revolutionary in its time, I know one of the other things that I find interesting about this movie is that at the time, 1969, the test screenings and early screenings of this movie, you had people that walked out vomiting because they thought it was so violent. And it is violent.
Sometimes I love doing this in particular with the BFI list, is we're getting to see kind of this progression of rankings from like a critical perspective of how do people view cinema. And then there's almost like this narrative to tell as we go down this list. Yeah. And it's interesting that Saw Low was the movie before this, because that's also a film that is when it was released, produces this very gut reaction to people in a way. And then you wouldn't necessarily, seeing The Wild Bunch today, you wouldn't assume people had such a gut reaction to it. But when you start to think about it, in 69, it's still the
69 versus the 70s is like decades as far as film progression.
Everyone is, it's beautiful. There's, what is, there's an old classic TV show I'm trying to think of.
Gunsmoke. The Rifleman.
No, but sure. I don't know. It's just so different and bloody and gory and wonderful. And the way that Sam Peckinpah, probably one of the first people to really insist that guns should have the proper sound to them. That I don't know if you read this, that they did the original pass on the film and all the guns sounded the same, and he made them re-record everything in order to have you feel all the bullets. There's a machine gun.
Every gun
there's
sounds
pistols,
different.
There's rifles.
Yep. pistols sound different from rifles, which sound different from that machine gun, and yeah, that's another reason why I appreciate it.
So here's my reaction to this film this time, because I think that's important. I liked it a little less this time.
You did? Oh no.
But let me. No. Okay, this is coming down from one of my favorite movies of all time. So when I say a little less, I mean like it's one of the best movies I've seen, but not one of my favorites.
Yeah, I gotcha.
I liked it a little less, but I respect it a hell of a lot more. I found so much more to look at and to think about, and just because I didn't like latch on to the film as much this time doesn't mean I don't respect it as much. And I think I stand by my statement that this is one of the best first acts, but I think the problem I had this time around is that in the director's cut, because that's what we watched, there's this moment after the stakes have been set, the goals are kind of there, that the group goes to this little Mexican town and then they go to Agua Verde.
Mm-hmm.
And the pacing kind of drags a little here and there. And in particular, there's this kind of party scene when they're at Mapache's village and they're in the steam room, and then the other two guys, the brothers, are in with the two women, and it just kind of goes on a little bit too long. Something. It feels fillery. It feels like it's not developing the story in any way. And I think that throughout the film, there are little moments here and there that could have been cut. And I think from what I read about the theatrical cut and the director's cut, I think the perfect cut is somewhere in between, closer to the director's cut, because I think the flashback sequences, which weren't in the original cut, are vital to how interesting Pike's character is. But there's some other stuff, like that partying scene, that it's not adding anything of substance that I think could trim it down by a little. But other than that,
I agree. Well, going into why I like this more the second time, and I'm just going to officially move us into spoiler territory, because one of the main... Sure. Okay, yeah, well, there we go. The main thing that I didn't like the first time around, that I didn't like this second time, but over the last few days I've come to really appreciate, is that I agree with you that the first act is amazing, because it sets up this these dual worlds of Pike and Thornton. Bishop is his name. Thornton. Pike and Thornton. It's the first act. It sets up this sort of... It makes you think that it's going to be like a cat and mouse game. That Thornton is constantly following Pike, and eventually it's going to come to this, interaction, and it never does. And initially I thought, okay, that's kind of misleading. It's kind of anticlimactic. And I thought that the second time too. But the more and more I think about it, the more I actually really appreciate that, because it's sort of emblematic of this idea that they're chasing this idea of the West that is dying. And the fact that they don't get this closure, this conclusion, is sort of reflective of this idea that it's gone. This idealization, these glory days are over. We're moving into a new world. And that's where I feel like Thornton is obviously chasing Pike for a reason. He was enlisted by the U.S. government to help him take him down. I don't know. They don't go into the specifics of it. I assume it's like one of those cases of he got caught, immunity is promised if you can help get him. It's that constant cat and mouse game that I felt like was going towards something, and it didn't. And I don't know. The ending especially is just so beautiful to me, in the way that, you have Thornton just sort of sitting defeated. His purpose is fulfilled. They don't need him anymore. He doesn't have anywhere to go. He doesn't have anyone to bond with.
His friends are dead. Pike.
His friends are all dead.
Despite all that they've gone through, he still cares about. I think one of the great indicative moments of the film that's so easy to miss is in the very beginning battle.
Yes,
Thornton
when they
has
meet
the chance to shoot Pike, but he doesn't. Yes, it's just great.
It's great. And at the end, when the old disgusting prospector comes up with a new ragtag game of old people, and Thornton's like, we got some work to do, and he says specifically, it ain't like it used to be, but it'll do. And that is where I'm like, okay, they never needed to meet, because it's done. He was probably chasing Thornton obviously with the idea of taking him down in mind, but also reconnecting, getting back together with his old self. But that old self is gone. And that's another thing that happens in the movie when Pike's gang goes to Mexico, because they go to Mexico, I think, with the idea that, okay, the America is gone, the American West is gone,
We can't
cars are
survive
here.
anymore.
Yes, so they go to Mexico and they see something similar with Mapache. Even the twisted and weird Mexican sense of government is still a form of government, and they realize they have nowhere else to go. And I find that very interesting.
Certainly, the contrast between America and Mexico, where Mexico is in this civil war, and then America's worried about temperance, for fuck's sake. But
Which, oh, by the way, that is the funniest part of the movie, is when that temperance guy is leading the temperance rally and he has everybody like repeat after him, and then he says something along the lines, "I will not consume any alcohol," and everybody who at this point was very ecstatic was like, "I will not participate in."
there's some surprisingly funny moments in this movie. It's very, yes. The great part about Mexico in this film is how subtly multifaceted the portrayal of Mapache is.
Yeah.
And the kind of the specter of history on Pancho Villa, which, it appears like in this film that Pancho Villa is like this hero of the resistance, that he's fighting for freedom or for more law and order, that there are these bandits, the Angels Village and his comrades are fighting for. But then that, it's something that in the history that Pancho Villa wins, and Mexico isn't necessarily any better off for it. And I think one of the great, that feeds into this idea of the West is dying.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's very much a cycle of these kinds of outlaws are being replaced with a different kind of outlaw, with the Mapaches of the world, of cops and order. But these things change. The spirit of the West is dying, but the idea is going to go on. And as they leave at the end of the film, as Thornton and the old guy leave, they're going on another adventure. That's one of the things I like about the film, is it begins with them riding into town in media res. We're thrown into it, and you have to figure it out from there. And then at the end, they're riding off into another journey. And it's very much a part of this flow of history, not just taken out of just a random event.
Exactly. That's another parallel to Sierra Madre, because I think the endings are very similar. You even have a laughter scene at the end of The Wild Bunch. But the idea is that, it's never going to go the way that you plan. Just go with the flow. Go with the flow of time. You can't stop what's coming. I think it's a very optimistic note to end on both of them. And yeah, also again, that whole riding off in the sunset thing. But I think it works in both of these movies.
So the thing that's really great about this is another really great script in terms of characterization.
And it's also one of those that it doesn't seem immediately great because it fucks with 3-act structure in weird ways. But the more and more you realize why it's doing that, it becomes great.
So now I need to touch on both of those, because this is another film I think that you can kind of put into a 5-part, not necessarily a 5-act structure, but a 5-part, because it has 3 main action sequences, which are probably my favorite parts of the film, that are just so wonderfully created on a film level and on a writing level. You have the opening scene with a bank robbery. You have the central train robbery. And then you have the ending massacre. And then there's kind of like these 2 large fallout periods in the middle of those 3.
A lot of camaraderie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as far as the characterization goes in this film, it's so wonderfully subtle, and it's everyone has it. Mapache. Yeah. I keep wanting to come back to Mapache because he seems like this very kind of villain-esque, but there's not necessarily depth, but there's layers to that villainy.
Yeah.
Of it's a well acted and performed character. One of my favorite little moments is they get the machine gun and he takes it out and he has all these people who's trying to help him hold it and they're shooting. Yeah. And then another great laugh in the film is he stops. He looks up and smiles. He's like, how's he reacting? And he just smiles, gives the camera kind of a smile, picks it up and starts shooting again after everyone comes out. And there's another moment that Pancho Villa raids the train and you see the riders are coming towards them and he just stays firm. He's a very brave man for being such a despicable person that you see why people follow him. It's not that he's just evil and people are following him because why not? He's got some chutzpah to him, if I'm to use borrow a Yiddish word. And you see another great motif in the film is the kid looking up at him and seeing the admiration for someone who is really despicable, but there is something worth looking up to. Yeah. And then that also plays into even more this idea of the cycles of violence that, the Western is dead, but this kind of violence, this kind of outlaw, the people who are looking up to these guys, they're going to grow up. Little kids are going to grow up and they're going to have their own version of it.
Well, that's like the first scene in the movie is the scene with the kids and the scorpion, which I think is very reflective of the whole thing where you have these scorpions. It's a scene where scorpions are eaten alive by ants and then burned by kids. Where you have these scorpions, these big deadly predators, relatively speaking to bugs, and they're not being killed by another big deadly predator. They're being killed by ants, which is similar to a society. Each individual ant can't necessarily take them on, but the collective altogether will eventually bring it down.
Which is the ending. When if we're to look at Pike and the group, they're the scorpions that, they're clearly better than all the little Mapache's troops, but they just get overwhelmed in the end by so much. And then to add insult to injury, I love the bounty hunters, these hillbilly bounty hunters, which are in most Westerns, there's like the law and the order, and the law is honorable and the criminals are criminals.
Yes.
But the bounty hunters in this, the people who are with Thornton, they're just
looting.
They're looting. They're losers. They're idiots. Yes. And to add insult to injury, these people who have no sense of honor are looting the dead bodies of Pike, of Ernest Borgnine's character. So much, like, it's disrespectful to these people. It's so many layers. That's what really gets me about the film.
Yes. And this idea of the moral ambiguity, which is another sort of thing about Sierra Madre, where we talked about these characters aren't all good or all bad. It's from the beginning, I think it sets this up, because the beginning, what I love about this movie, it just throws you into it. Mm-hmm. It's a shot of them walking. The wild bunch, the quote unquote like criminal organization, they're wearing the police officer outfits or the Mountie-esque outfits. And they start this bank robbery, and then you see Thornton with, all the other bounty hunters on the roof. And it's very unclear from the beginning who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Because, yes, you have the law, who is hillbilly, gross looters, but then you have the criminals who are very clearly committing a crime, sticking up this bank, that are... They're fun. They're fun to be around. They're a ragtag group of outcasts. And it never settles into good or bad. It's just consistently, these are the people, this is the times, judge for yourself. And another huge part of it, like we said with the casting of Sierra Madre, these characters are very much emblematic of the actors. Humphrey Bogart has always had this darkness about him that I think plays really well in Sierra Madre. This movie in particular, it's a movie that very much deals with this idea of reconciling with your past, that the past is the past and there's no way to change it. You can just move forward. Shortly before this movie, I don't know if you know this, William Holden was in Europe. Maybe Europe? I don't remember. He had drunkenly killed somebody. Getting really drunk and driving his sports car Ferrari, I think, and accidentally killed somebody in a DUI accident. And I think a part of what makes Pike such a great character is Holden has this look to him the entire movie where you can see so much history in just his face. He's a grumpy old man, but you can also see in his eyes the rebellious outlaw that you know he was, even if the movie doesn't show you.
I was listening to the commentary on this film, so I almost watched it twice, but I didn't quite get through all of it. I was kind of paying attention to other stuff while I was listening to that. And so this is not an original idea, and I just have to echo it, that obviously the opening credit sequence is great, but it's so one of the best director credits of all time.
Yes.
Where William of Holden says, if they move,
shoot him.
Kill him. Or shoot him. Yeah. Which is a great line. And then it's just kind of emphasized with this sting of the music, and it goes to Sam Peckinpah's opening credit. And it's so deliciously, like, it sets up the delicious violence of the film that Sam Peckinpah's like, this is gonna be good. William Holden has this great face that shows history and kind of guilt, and a lot of his character is about that guilt of abandoning Thornton earlier. And the plot of this film, it's so easy to mistake the kind of surface level that's going on as the actual plot, but the actual impetus of why things happen in this film are actually really under the surface. And it's all really about William Holden's character coming to terms with the fact that he left Thornton behind, and the fact that he is always preaching to his group, you don't abandon the group. You have to be loyal to each other. And that really comes into play at the very end when Angel gets captured. And this kind of
like a redemption
that he needs redemption, and which is ironic because it's a redemption of just mass murder, but it's living up to your morals that you have always preached but never truly lived by, and that he finally feels that there's nowhere else to go, and that I have to do right by what I've always been saying and by Angel. And it's a great moment in the end of the film, this lead up to that final shootout, where they're all they've gone to visit the whores. Then the group is just sad, kind of silent, and there's not a word passed between them except for I think it's "let's go," and then one of them says "why not," and that's it. That's all you need to understand that they're kind of committed to this final act, this selfish act of immorality to protect their morality.
It's not only that they're doing this to save Angel as a sort of redemption. I think at also this point they're kind of like, well, America's done with us. Mexico's going to be done with us soon. We're not going to go out old and weak. If we're going to go out, this is how we're going to go out. The West dies, we die. Yeah. I think that's another reason why the ending is so great. But I think what makes this movie interesting, like I said before, with John Huston being a super masculine director working under the Hays Code, Sam Peckinpah is an interesting guy. Sam Peckinpah, I did a little research on Sam Peckinpah. He was a World War II soldier. Not necessarily, he didn't fight. He was stationed in China, where he had gone on record saying he saw awful, awful, awful things. His father died when he was young, so he was largely raised by his mother, but his grandfather was around to make sure he was a very, masculine, rough around the edges man. And you can kind of see, because he very much idolized his mother and his grandfather, so there's this constant wrestle with his own emotions that came from his mother and the typical man that came from his grandfather. He was very much a man who was in touch with his feminine side, to the point where there are rumors that he was gay, possibly. And I think you can see that a lot in this movie, where Pike's character is a man who is wrestling with the severed bond between Thornton, and sort of answers that that lack of closure with violence. And I think it's very emblematic of who Peckinpah was as a person, because the violence, he when he was shooting this felt uncomfortable with it because he thought that it would be glorified, and it is to an extent. It's fun.
Mm-hmm.
Very like the three big sequences: the opening, the train, and the ending. There's a lot of Tarantino specifically in this. The final scene, all I could think of was the shootout in Django Unchained. Just the way that the blood looks almost cherry-like in its flavor. But I don't know if glorifying this violence, I don't know what that does to the overall themes in the story. And that's the one thing I sort of wrestle with about this movie.
I think it's a movie you can think about for a long time and still come up with new answers. And because it's not fully consistent within its portrayal of violence and morality.
As opposed to Sierra Madre, which is pretty cut and dry in what it's trying to say.
Yeah, although Sierra Madre also has that kind of, these characters aren't all perfect. They're not, like Tim Holt's character in that film. He's potentially a murderer. He's willing to kill people for what he wants. It doesn't, but this film just kind of ups the ante of Sierra Madre. It essentially takes Houston's severing of Bogart's head at the end that the studio cut, and is like, oh, let's just do that for the whole film, and so let's go for it all out. And on a more kind of superficial level, on more like filmmaking terms, the central train heist scene, every time I watch the film, I have a different favorite central set piece, whether it's like the first opening scene or the last massacre. But I think there's something so much fun and intelligence to that central train heist. I love it so much. I think that was my favorite part about this viewing.
That train heist wasn't even in the script. It wasn't something that they had in the story. There's something that they just thought, oh, we should do this. It's largely improvised,
and
which blows my mind.
From what I understand, Sam Peckinpah arrived there on the set that day and blocked it out there.
And, drawing parallels to movies and stuff that came out beforehand, this reminds me so much of the train heist episode of Breaking Bad.
Oh, yeah. Another influence there.
Which I find interesting because both these things, the most interesting part about it is that it's a train heist where the train is stopped.
And it's about trying to get away with it without anyone knowing.
Yes. There's a clockwork precision to the way that they rob this train. And I agree that's probably my favorite part of the movie.
Emblematic. I think the film really hits its stride once they go to rob that train for the second half of the film, in that you really see how intelligently Peckinpah designs a lot of the sequences and how the characters are written to be intelligent. And that's one of the great things, is that you have Thornton, who is a very cunning man who understands Bishop and is a worthy adversary, although they don't really clash all that much.
Yep.
And then you have Bishop, who is so smart about the way that he plans his crime, and that's his crowning achievement, is that kind of central heist. But at the same time, you have the positive of he's so smart in the way that he deals with this kind of stuff, and at the same time he's not someone who, he preaches a lot, but his main fault probably is that he doesn't always live what he preaches.
He's a great leader, not a great man. And I think that's what I find so interesting about him.
And, Thornton is the opposite of that, where he's equally intelligent, but the people following him are idiots. So he has the opposite problem.
Yes.
Where his problem is other people and Pike's problem is himself.
Also, fun fact for the people who are just interested, the man who employs Thornton, the guy you see really only at the beginning, that man is a freak, and he died in a very, very, very weird way. So I implore you to look it up.
Okay, I will
get into that now. Yeah. So the burning question is, Jacob, does this deserve to be on the BFI list?
Well, along with that, it's number 7, as I mentioned last week with Salo.
Mhm.
It's number 75, tied with many other things on the director's half of that list.
Yeah.
It is on the AFI in 2008. They did a top 10 Westerns. It's
Mhm.
number 6 on that list. The AFI on their original
It's on the
100
top
movies,
100.
it's number 80.
Yeah.
It's number 79 on their 10th anniversary. On the Empire Magazine top 500 greatest films, that's number 94. It was voted on for the Editors Guild, the 23rd best edited film of all time. And like Treasure of the Sierra Madre, it has also been inducted into the Library of Congress for preservation.
Yep.
So this is a film that has a lot of critical acclaim
staying
baggage.
power.
Yeah. Here's the funny thing. I think Treasure of the Sierra Madre might be the better film.
It is.
And I think that deserves to be on this list.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give it a full-on yes. I'm not going to give Wild Bunch a full-on yes for being on this list.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to say yes. If that makes sense. I'm not
Yeah.
fully
No,
on...
I get you. You would prefer Sierra Madre because they're similar and Sierra Madre does it better. But if it's a question of whether or not it deserves to be on there, if it's already selected, you would say yes.
It has more than enough reasons to be here.
Yes, and I'm gonna agree. As far as Westerns go, it's one of the most interesting, not only thematically but stylistically. Yeah, I like it a hell of a lot more this time around. Hard agree. Put it on there.
It is a film that has influenced many a movie. I think a lot of
Lots
action
of
films
movies.
have been influenced by it, by this kind of last action battle. It's one of those first movies that really like builds up to this huge climax of violence.
The editing style too. Obviously.
Editing, quick, so quick editing that you don't really, even like years, decades to come, a lot of the editing isn't that quick. And it's only until much more recently that films are normally that quick of editing during action sequences.
Yeah. So this concept of the overly edited action sequence is something that I feel like isn't necessarily as bad as people say, but what kills me as far as this style goes is when you like look outward and you can see through the edited clips that this is basically a decently filmed, if not kind of badly filmed scene that is sort of made artificially more exciting by the editing. Whereas when you look at this, the cuts are quick, but every shot is so distinct and different from one another that you can tell that this was a huge action scene edited down to a quick one, and it feels a lot more impressive. Whereas something like, the Bourne movies, which are similar, are like maybe one or two scenes edited to feel like many. So this is one of the few instances where rapid cut action scenes are actually very interesting.
Yep.
So yeah, hard recommend. One of the few episodes where we hard recommend both movies.
Yeah, it is pretty violent, so I'm not sure it's everyone's cup of tea.
But it's not. It's by today's standards, it's not like nausea-inducing.
No, and when we're talking about Salo again, I think these films have to have some kind of balance between thematic appeal, cinematic achievement, influence, and audience appeal. I think something like this that is off-putting to a lot of people don't like this violence in films. I think even if they watched it, I think there's a lot still there to look at and to like, and there are still a lot of people who like this despite the violence, and not as so much. It's not as niche as something like Salo is with its depiction of taboo things.
Salo is a lot harder of a watch, and it came out relatively in the same time. So I don't think this is. Yeah, it's only like 5 or 6 years difference, but yeah, this is a lot more moderate. I mean, obviously, if you're still averse to gore, this isn't great, but the gore looks delicious in the sense that it literally looks like a cherry pie.
Yeah.
It's like cherry jam.
A few more fun influences from Treasure of the Sierra Madre. The scene that I mentioned where all of the native Mexicans in the village where Howard goes to save the little kid. It's echoed in Wild Bunch, where they're in Angel's hometown and they're leaving, and all the hometown is singing as they leave. A great lyrical scene. There's just so much that is similar. Both of them have like ruins of towns in them. They're both about getting the gold, and in the end, it's not necessarily, that's not the end goal.
Both are primarily, like I said, primarily in Mexico. Both are, both have relatively older actors.
Yeah. This one, both of them were filmed in, they were both filmed in Durango, the province or the state of Mexico. Wild Bunch was also in Coahuila. So more central Mexico, which is interesting because it looks a lot like Sonoran Desert here.
Yeah.
So it's not too far off from the landscape that we're used to. But it's actually pretty far south, down into central Mexico, where they're filming this. And another little film history bit: the blowing up of the bridge felt very much reminiscent of The General.
Buster Keaton.
Yeah,
The General.
Blowing up the bridge with like the practical stunt, except this time there's people and horses on it, which is a great practical thing. You worry for the horses, but they were all fine.
Oh God. Well. Were they all fine? Because the fact that they burned ants and scorpions alive leads me to believe this is not the most PETA-friendly
well, the ants and
movie.
Scorpions, no, they did not have a fun time on
they're very
set.
dead. Very dead, yes.
From what I understand, the horses were fine.
Yes.
They might have had some minor bruises on that fall down, which is, you can't get away with that anymore these days.
Well, one of the most anxiety-inducing things to me is just seeing people on horses cross rivers with their horse. I don't know why. It's another thing that you see in like the Coen Brothers True Grit where that happens. But as far as I know, the horses can swim, obviously. So whatever, it's fine.
That was The Wild Bunch. Great movie.
Hard to recommend. Yeah, it is very different in a good way. So what is next week's movie?
We're gonna review Da Bloods. Yes.
I feel weird saying Da Bloods, but that is how it's like his movie Da Blood of Jesus, which also has I just feel weird, but
that's great.
Yes. So The Five Bloods, the new Spike Lee film on Netflix.
We're gonna review that, and then our BFI film of the week is a film that I'm guessing Chandler has never heard of before. It is The Color of Pomegranates.
What?
Which
that sounds awful.
It is a Armenian Soviet film.
Okay.
So our first Soviet film by Sergei Parajenkov. I hope I got that right. It's a very avant-garde film. I think I've watched the first 5 minutes at one point, and I didn't. Did you? It is only an hour and 15 minutes long. It's from 1969.
I see 80 minutes.
And I think it's going to be interesting. This is the only film I know of from this area of the world, from Armenia. So
all I'm going to say is that the only other time that there's been a movie that I haven't heard anything about was The Imitation of Life. So I'm very excited.
Well, let's cross our fingers. I'm curious.
I'm curious too.
Into a new culture at the very least. Yes.
I'm always curious when there's a movie that a bunch of critics and directors have agreed that is great that I've never heard of. But hopefully I don't think it'll be as interesting a pairing as these two, but I'm hoping for the best.
Probably a very random pairing.
I'm sure it will be. We'll try our best though. Possibly with a guest. Not sure yet. We'll see.